Welcome all of you to the Sustainable Procurement Webinar 2021. I'm Felix Lam of Green Council and will be one of the moderators for this webinar. And we also have another moderator, Mr. Stephen Kong of IPS Hong Kong, to partner with me to moderate this webinar. Today, topic of today's webinar is global supply chain put to test. Will it last? Yeah, I think everyone knows that the outbreak of COVID-19 and the global efforts to stop its spread have disrupted the normal supply chain. Procurement and supply chain professionals have been very busy to manage the disruption and also the increasing logistic costs. Global sea freight rates are breaking their records and still continue to skyrocket. This webinar will address this issue. Today, we are glad to have an expert who will provide insight for us. During the presentation, if you have any question, please write down on the question box. We shall answer your question during the Q&A section after the presentation. Stephen, will you please help me to introduce our speaker today?
Sure, thanks, Felix. Well, thank you very much. Our speaker is Nicholas De Rossi. And Nicholas is the president of a Supply Chain Management Outsource, a global network of professional firms providing advisory in logistics, transportation, and supply chain management as well. Their experts help transform supply chain challenges into a strategic and competitive advantages. Full 40 offices in 25 countries. To cut it short, Nicholas is also the author of a lot of books, for example, Transportation and the Belt and Road Initiative. And let me pass the stage to Nicholas to start the presentation. Nicholas, please.
Thank you, Stephen. I will remove my mask. Can we go to the presentation, please? I will talk today about the global supply chains, which are currently being put to the test. Globalization is conducive to human evolution. This is demonstrated by the risk mitigation principle and the emergence theory. I can't see, I can't read from here, it's a bit far away, but it's okay. In 1800, there were 1 billion people on the planet, and they were using 2/3 of their budget to feed themselves. That is at the time that we start to use machines and energy. We call it the Industrial Revolution. As the consequence, in 1930, there were 2.5 billion people on the planet who were using only 1/3 of their budget to feed themselves. And it is also at that time that we start to use modern fertilizers, a mix of phosphate, potassium, and nitrogen. And as a result of using modern fertilizers, machines, and energy, we are today 7.8 billion people using only 3% of their budget to feed themselves. That does not include the very lower class of the population. No, people in Africa or Central Asia, which do not use machine and energy, they still go to the field with a buffalo, so they're still using 2/3 of their budget. Now, what is interesting to know, you can see in the map behind the arrows, these millions of trades all over the planet. And these are the trades which facilitate that globalization. Indeed, there is transportation between the source of energy and the point of consumption of that energy. There is transportation between the source of fertilizers and the points of consumption of those fertilizers. There is also transportation between the place where we produce the food and the place where we consume the food. It is interesting to know, for instance, that 50% of the trucks used all over the world are transporting food. Now, the situation today is very interesting. We have a double energy fighting themselves all over the world, not only in the US or in Europe, all over the world. We have part of the humanity that wants to evolve and wants to globalize, to go to this unknown that is globalization. And there is part of humanity that is absolutely terrified by the unknown that globalization represents. And they prefer the familiarity and the comfort of nationalism. So that's the situation today. Supply chain management, what does it mean? You take the world upside down, is management of the chain of supply. Everything we use on the planet as human beings comes from 3 origins only: water, in the lakes, in the rivers, or in the sea. Or it's harvested from above the ground, forests, fields, or husbandry. Or it's harvested from inside the ground, minerals oil and gas. Then that is the source, you see, and then it is stored somewhere and transported, that's a little arrow, to a place of transformation. We call that a factory, where it is transformed, stored and transported to another place of transformation. So there can be many, many transformations. And then it's going to be stored and transported to a place of consumption, where you and I will go to supermarket, hypermarket, 7-Eleven, buy the things, consume it, put it in a rubbish bin, where it will be either recycled into the supply chain or thrown out on the landfills. So the supply chain management is this mix of transportation, payment, and documentation you see underneath. It is important to know that in global trade, transformation represents 50% of the global trade. And when we see, we hear about people talking about trade and value chain, and you see we understand now what supply chains are, but what are value chains? But you see, between the source and every steps of transformation until the point of consumption, the same product has acquired value. And that is called the chain of value or the value chain. Trade. Trade in 2020 represents $19 trillion in merchandise trade, $6 trillion in service trade, and over $30 trillion in digital trade. Now, in 2020, we have a 5% decrease in volumes of merchandise trade and 8% decrease in value. That is not only due to COVID-19, it is also due as a result of the global successive trade wars that the US did to the world at large, not only to China, but to the world at large, which resulted in 2019 in a minus 3% of volume of trade. Now, service trade in 2020 decreased tremendously by 25%. So you can see that in transportation, we are minus 20%. That is due of the air transportation, which decreased a lot. And then it's also due to travel. The whole travel industry has gone down the drain more or less with a minus 60% decrease. Basically, all international traveling and tourism has died. Transportation mode, we define at SCMO 7 transportation modes: air transportation, rail transportation, road transportation, also called trucking, sea transportation, including inland waterways and so on, and pipeline transportation for oil, gas, and chemical products, grid transportation for the electricity, and digital transportation all over the internet. I have highlighted in yellow the structure of this presentation, and you can see that the point number 2 is courier transportation, which is a mix of air transportation and road transportation. The point 6, container freight, is the meat of this presentation, if I may say so. Now, when we look at the modal split of transportation, you can see it in value on the left, in volume on the right. Is very interesting. You can see in value on the left that half of transportation is sea transportation, which is blue and brown. Now, interestingly, the blue and brown in volume represents 2/3 or 3/4 of transportation. So that's interesting to understand. Now, what is also fascinating to see is the value on the left of the purple, which is air transportation, 35% of the value transported. On the right, it only represents 0.25% of the volume. So imagine the value that it represents is very high. And when we look at the blue only on the left and the right, which is container transportation, we can see that the value is more than the volume in share because it is consumer goods or because it is transformed goods, while the brown, which is commodities, is the cheapest that can be. That's why we call it commodities. Air transportation. Air transportation is the image you see in the background, is 100,000 flights every day, which are made out of 26,000 planes, out of which a bit less than 2,000 planes are what we call freighters or cargo plane. Now, these freighters carry 50% of the volume. The other 50% is carried in the passenger planes, in what we call the cargo hold, which is under the passenger cabin where you and I sit when we are there. Now, you can see on the bottom right, actually, you cannot see it because, yes, you can see it. We have a plus 30% of increase in revenues for cargo. Thank you very much. So plus 30%, now you're going to tell me, but why? If we have a plus 30%, half the airlines lost $126 billion in 2020. Why are there 50 airlines bankrupt out of the 300 airlines of the IATA? It is because the traditional revenue model of airlines is 80% coming from passenger transportation, and 20% coming from cargo transportation. And passenger transportation has decreased by 70%. There were less 95% of passengers all over the world in 2020. So that is the reason why. And you must understand, passenger flights, all the flights decreased by half in 2020. There were only 46,000 flights every day in average. Well, usually it is 100,000 flights, remember. So as a result, in 2020, in the first half of 2020, air freight rates increased by 12 times, 1,200% increase, and they are still today at 4 times the price. Now, this is the result of an unbalance between supply and demand. Supply in blue, demand in red. And you can see that starting from April 2020, the demand in red is higher than the supply available, which explains why these rates have increased. Now, courier and post. The post office has been a total failure all over the world in 2020. Of course, post office are part of the institutions of every administrations. And basically, there was no air mail offered for at least 6 months all over the world, and no surface mail, that's by sea transportation, offered for 1 year. And it is still completely absent in more than half the countries in the world. So what the post office were still offering was their courier service called the speed post, or EMS, depending on the country, and that was still working. But you had a probability of 80% that if you were sending masks or PPE, it would be stolen somewhere along the line before being received by the addressee. Now, what saved the day in 2020 were the private courier companies, people like FedEx, UPS, DHL, and all the other ones. They respected the rates. They did not increase the rates much. There was a small peak season surcharge of 15%, 15 only. Out of the 2 or 3 layers of rate they offered the highest with probably the lowest quality of service due to the congestion. But at least you had an 80% probability to be delivered at destination. So that's important to know. Now, courier companies are targeted all over the world at the moment for 2 reasons. The first reason is that e-commerce has increased tremendously before COVID-19 anyway as well, and therefore the threshold for no tax has decreased from $50 in average all over the world to 15. So that's the first reason. That is normal. Governments need to harvest taxes. Now, what is less normal is that normally when you were sending a sample to somebody all over the world or a present to a friend, you were not charging anything, so you will make an invoice of $1 because that's a legal requirement, but you would not be charged duties and taxes. Nowadays, all over the world, governments will charge you arbitrary duties and taxes in this case, and if you do not pay, your parcel will be confiscated. Rail, China, Europe. So there is the rail infrastructure between China and Europe has a capacity of 1 million TEU per year. And in 2021, this year, we are trying to push at 1.5 million TEU or 1.4 million TEU to see whether it's going to go through or not. We'll see, time will say. As a result, we have a 50% increase in rates, which are actually 2.5% increase in rates, which is now at $18,000. It was at 14, it just increased to 18 in early September. And we also have a congestion to 2 to 3 weeks. That means 10 days congestion at origin, that is in Korgos and Alashenko, that is at the border between China and Kazakhstan, where there is a rail gauge change. Therefore, we need to move to change trains. And also at destination in Malazevich in Poland, just at the border with Belarus, where the trains are unloaded onto trucks and then delivered all over Europe. And that means, you must understand, 100 or more than 100 kilometers of traffic jams on the railways. That is what it means. It's enormous. Now, you see the rates are quite interesting. They're not too high compared with sea freight rates at the moment, but there is a real limit of capacity. That let's imagine we succeed to put 1.4 million TEUs on the railways in 2021. That represents only 6% of the volumes of 24 million TEUs which are exchanged between Asia and Europe. Trucking. There is a relatively confidential trucking trade between China and Europe, which represents 12,000 trucks or 24,000 TEUs in 2021. There is, with a rate very expensive at 34,000 TEUs per 40-foot high cube. And there is a congestion of 1 week at origin in Alashenko. So if you pay the VIP surcharge of 5,000, you are now therefore at $39,000. You pass right away without waiting 1 week. and you are delivered in Europe in 2 weeks. Much better in transit time than by rail, which is now between 1 month and 1.5 months, or by sea freight, which is now more than 2 months in any case, in any lucky case. Now, the volume of this trade is also very small, is 0.1% of the volumes of 24 million TEUs between Asia and Europe. Now, all over the rest of the trucking is at ports, airports for first mile and last mile. There, especially due to lockdowns, there are huge congestion problems. And there are also some feedback loops which are not very sexy to appear. Imagine you have a port which is in lockdown. That means working between 0 and 100% of capacity and of productivity, as we say. And then you have 10, 20, 50 ships starting to wait in front of it. And then, of course, when the lockdown is finished, then it goes at full productivity, and everything is unloaded as fast as possible. Then you need more trains and more trucks. More trains, that does not exist, but more trucks, you need as many trucks as you can. But the problem, spare parts of the trucks were on the ships that needed to be unloaded, and trucks need to be maintained. You could not maintain all the trucks. Therefore, when you need more trucks, you will have less trucks. So you see, and so that is one of the elements, but you have many more elements, which makes that actually you have less drivers. People are either passed away from COVID, or they are sick from COVID, or they don't want to be sick from COVID, so they call sick, and therefore you have less trucks, and so on and so on and so on. So ultimately, as a consequence, at ports, airports, first mile and last miles, you have an increase of trucking rates, which are enormous all over the world. Sea transportation, whatever human beings have built that floats on water is 34.1 million ships, out of which leisure ships represent 30 million ships. 4 million ships are fishing vessels. An estimated 4,700 ships are military vessels, and what we are interested into is the more or less 100,000 ships which are commercial ships. The image you see in the background is 275,000 ships, which have taken the picture yesterday on marine traffic. Let's look at commercial ships. The split on the left is the split by kind of ships. It's very interesting. I'll let you have a look at it when you come back to that video, which will be recorded and published by the Green Council and by IFPSM. On the right is more interesting. You have the cargo tonnage. You can see that 50% of the sea transportation is done by dry bulk. And you are interested to know that half of that is iron ore. That means 25% of sea transportation is iron ore, which means that 20% of all transportation in the world is iron ore. I'll let you study what iron ore is used for. Now, containers in yellow is interesting. That's 20% of the cargo tonnage transported, and the rest is energy, basically. Bulk and tanker freights. So very interesting, you see, there is not enough capacity for container ships. So shipping lines have chartered all the available container ships available on the world. There is not one container ship not used at the moment, especially if they are impounded or in repair. Now, then they have started to charter all the bulk ships to put containers on it. And as a consequence, there's an increase of 6 times of the rates for small container ships, especially, which have now gone for $30,000 a day instead of 5, sorry. So that is crazy. But and also is increasing the congestion at bulk ports all over the world, because remember, bulk ports require more human beings. And that is, we are the weak link in the COVID-19 equation. Tankers, that's very easy. They are specialized terminals with pipelines. It's plug and play. There is very little use of human beings, and we are the weak link, so there is no impact for them. Container freight, that's the meat of that presentation. Nowadays, in 2021, there is 5,500 ships in the world, container ships, out of which there is a capacity of 25 million slots or TEUs, and the volumes transported in the world in 2020 are 226 million TEUs. That means basically that every slot on a ship has been used 9 times per year. That's a ratio you have to keep in mind. So that's a utilization of a ship. Now, the volumes in 2020 decreased actually by 1%. Everybody's saying in the news that it increased. It did not increase. It decreased by 1%. And the container in shipping trade value, the value of what is transported, is $4 trillion. Now, the rate is the result of many variables. But in this specific case, there are 3 key variables that we want to look at. First, the capacity. Is there enough space on my ship to load my cargo? 2, equipment. Can I find a container to put my cargo into in order to ship it. 3 ports. Is the port where I'm loading and where I am unloading getting into lockdown, and therefore has it become a bottleneck? So we will look at each of these variables in depth now. You need to understand that. These are container ships. This is a real scale container ship. On top, the first container ship, 1956, it's only 500 TEUs. On the bottom, the latest container ship, 25 or 26,000 TEUs. You can just imagine how many times bigger it is, and you have the image in front of your eyes. Interesting to know, 250 years ago, before machines and energy, we were using these sailing ships between Europe and Asia or China. And that was taking between 6 months and 1 year, depending on the winds. These ships were between 100 tons or TEUs and 100 tons and 500 tons. The bigger ships today are between 400 and 500,000 tons. So we have increased the size of those ships before 250 years ago and today by 1,000 times. There is the supply in blue, demand in red. And you can see that that the demand went down the drain in early 2020. WTO told the shipping lines, be careful, COVID is coming, the trade is going to go down. Shipping lines laid off as many ships as they can, but they still lost money. You see the demand was even lower. Now, after the demand started to pick up, and the shipping lines have put all their ships back into auction. That took 2 to 3 weeks to be done. There was no delay. And then they started to charter all the cellular ships or container ships available in the world, and then now bulk ships. And as a result, there is still more demand than supply, and this is what we have in the rates all over the world. The rates have never been as high as they are today. We have rates on the big trades, Asia, Europe, Asia, US, at $20,000 for spot rates for 40-foot high cube. I've heard about $23,000 plus 5,000 VIP surcharge to be loaded now and not in 3 weeks. That's a 10 to 15 times increase. The Panamax port charter rates for cellular ships, that means for container ships, are also increased by 15 times. Let's look at the second variable, containers. Why do we call them intermodal container? A container is very simple. It's a box of 2.5 meter by 2.5 meter multiplied by 6 meter long. Keep that in mind, it's made in metal, okay? And so that's what we call a 20-foot container. Now, the 40-foot container is the same, but double the length. 2.5 by 12 meters instead of 6. And the 40-foot high cube is the same as 40 foot, just 30 centimeters higher on the ceiling. Now, that allows to put all your stuff into these containers and then to transport them easily. To transport them easily on ships, on trains, or on trucks. And also to transport them easily in the ports. So because you can transport it easily, you commoditize all this mode of transportation and it becomes cheaper. That's why we use these containers. It's much cheaper than using bulk. Now you see the container ship capacity, as I said earlier, is 25 million TEUs, and the container fleet, the number of containers in the world is between 43 to 70 million containers in the world. That is a ratio of 3. That means when you have a container on a ship, you have somewhere a container which is loading at a factory in the world, and somewhere you have a third container which is unloading at a supermarket or at a warehouse in the world. That's what it means. That is the utilization of containers, and that is what has slowed down at the moment, which is dramatic. And then there is a volume transported of 226 million TEUs in 2020. That's a ratio of 4. That means every container is used 4 times in a year. So at the moment, these containers are being basically delayed everywhere in the world because of these lockdowns and so on. And as a consequence, they're not flowing as smoothly as they should. So we have ordered as many containers as we could from the manufacturers, and the price have doubled, but still it is not enough. There is a traditional imbalance between containers of 20 foot and 40 foot and 40 foot high cube between Asia and the rest of the world. Asia produces consumer goods which are volumetric, that means high in volume, and very light. Therefore, Asia uses 40 foot and 40 foot high cube containers to ship to Europe and to ship to the Americas. On the other hand, Europe and Americas, what do they ship to Asia? They ship machines which are very small in volume and very heavy. They use 20 foot containers, and they send fertilizers, they send chemical products which are in bags, which are very heavy and small in volume. Therefore, they use 20-foot container. So there is this equipment balance that the shipping lines are used to manage, and it's a dance that they have always been managing smoothly. And with the ratio that you saw earlier in numbers of containers, it is more than enough. There is more than enough containers. The problem is as follows. In the first half of 2020, China was in lockdown. And therefore, there could not be this, what we call empty repositioning by the shipping lines because they could not access China. And that created the imbalance, started to create the imbalance. And then the second half of 2020, the rest of the world was in lockdown. And so that added to the problem. So in August, basically, there was no more 40-foot and 40-foot I-cube available in China or in Asia in general. So what do? Well, we use 220-foot containers to compensate. As a result, at the end of December, there was no more containers at all in Asia. You see, and these containers, they were all in the other ports of the world, and they have to be now repositioned as empty. And that is the challenge we are meeting. So there is enough containers, they're not at the right place at the moment, and that creates a disequilibrium. Let's look at the third variable, which is the bottlenecks. There are 9 major bottlenecks in the world. You now know about the Suez Canal, obviously, but did you know that Gibraltar Strait controls 25% of oil and gas? Did you know that Malacca Strait controls 30% of oil and trade? And you see, in the world, you have these 9 major bottlenecks, but you also have ports, seaports, the commercial ports that we use, that's 18,000 ports. And we also have 3,200 airports offering transportation services. So these can be locked down at any time and become a bottleneck. And out of these ports, 18,000 ports, more than 100 of them have a throughput of more than 1 million TEUs for containers. That means they are major ports and they can be a major headaches. So let's have a look at the incidents we have met. Last year, COVID is starting. So China is actually in lockdown between 1.5 to 4 months. That is immobilizing 22 million TEUs. And that is the impact that needs after to be resolved in the global supply chain. The challenge, as I mentioned, after you had other incidents, other lockdowns in the world, and this year in 2021 in March, we had the Suez Canal incident, where for hopefully only 6 days, we had the Suez Canal in lockdown. Stuck. It was not in lockdown, it was stuck. But that also impacted 20 million TEUs, 400 ships, out of which a quarter of them were container ships. But you saw the challenge. You have to know there is a 2 weeks in global supply chain or in supply chain in general, there is a 2 weeks tipping point. Under 2 weeks, everybody's patient and is waiting for the situation to resolve itself. Beyond 2 weeks, people there will be structural changes. They will change something in order to resolve it by themselves. Then there is a Yantian incident in June that lasted for 4 weeks. Yantian was locked down for 4 weeks because of people had COVID-19. There were 12 or 13 crew with COVID-19. And despite that, they were working so hard. I mean, they were still having a 30% productivity while they were in lockdown, but that impacted 400 container ships. They impacted 2 million TEUs. You see, there were 800,000 TEUs immobilized between the ships and between the shipyard. So that has a strong impact. And so all over the world, what we have between 100 and 100 ports which are in lockdown constantly, out of the 18,000 ports I mentioned earlier. And that basically immobilizes constantly 10% of the shipping fleet and 20% of the container fleet, of the containers themselves. Let's look at the chaos theory. The chaos is the image we see in the background. All the people in the logistics, consciously or not, are experts at chaos theory. We are chaos masters. I like to say that, sorry guys. Now, we have what is called the butterfly effect. The butterfly effect is complex. Let's look at the snowball effect, which is linear and simple. Okay, you have a lockdown at a port, you have 50 ships waiting in front. You need, when the lockdown is finished, you unload everything, you need more trucks. But because the spare parts were on the containers which were not unloaded, you have less trucks when you need more trucks. That's a snowball effect. Easy to understand, is linear. Butterfly effect is that multiplied by 1 trillion times in all directions with global consequences or impacts. That's what the butterfly effect is. Very complicated. Then we have in supply chain what is called the bullwhip effect. The bullwhip effect is at source. Let's say you have 3 weeks delay. Then at transformation, because you have usually more than one place of transformation, it becomes 3 months, or it becomes 1 month. And then at consumption, it becomes 3 months. And that can start at anywhere in the supply chain. That's the bullwhip effect. And then we have what is called feedback loops. What governments are usually very, very bad at planning ahead. So if you have capacity, you have not enough capacity on the big trades, Asia, Europe, Asia, US, then you take ships from the smaller trades to put there. Of course, because you want the rates to go down and you want to offer to your customers more capacity. But as a result, all the smaller trades have less capacity, so the rates go up there. This is a feedback loop. Or container ship freight, not enough capacity, or you go to bulk, air freight, rail freight, trucking. You see, and that's a feedback loop. Or ship order books. All the shipping lines in 2021 have ordered 15 to 20% of their global capacity. That takes 2 years to build these big ships. In 2023, in 2 years, they will come to the market. 20% in one time. We have never seen that, you see, in history of container ships. So that might calm down the rates if it's not calmed down before, let's say in the next Chinese New Year or something else. And then there is nearshoring. Nearshoring is, okay, why do we use China and India as the factories of the world? Very simple, the populations are massive, and the logic in trade is always, if I manufacture 2, it's cheaper than 1. So in China and India, you can have massive factories manufacturing 100 million of this or that piece of that product. And therefore it's cheaper than a factory in Europe or in Mexico or in Eastern Europe or in Northern Africa manufacturing 20 million of the same piece. As simple as that. But if transportation becomes a big challenge, then you go to Mexico, you go to North Africa or Eastern Europe, you will manufacture at a bit higher cost, but it will still be cheaper because the cost of transportation is so high. And that nearshoring is happening much faster than people imagine. If you own the factory, it takes 1 to 2 years to move it. If you're just buying from suppliers, it takes you 1 to 2 months to diversify your supplier base. And when COVID-19 is finished and all this supply chain havoc is finished, if that supplier in China and India is still alive and has not bankrupted, you might use it again. Of course, you will if it's cheaper. Otherwise, if it's bankrupt, you can't. You see, and then there is the worst of the worst in supply chain, the bottlenecks. The bottlenecks is similar for the global supply chain of humanity, similar to the blood system in a human being. So when you have a bottleneck, you have an organ failure. So Suez Canal, or let's say the first China incident last year is a heart attack. Suez Canal is a liver failure. And Yantian is another heart attack. And at the moment, we have 100 to 120 heart attacks or organ failures all over the global supply chain of humanity. Consequences, resilience and risk mitigation. So if you have rising inefficiencies, therefore you have and rising transportation costs, therefore you create more inventory to be more safe, of course. That means you put your cash flow into the inventory, you have less cash flow, and that's a challenge. And then there is nearshoring as a consequence, which I explained earlier. There is also diversification. You diversify for modes of transportation, but also shipping lines contracts at the moment become more interfaced with the big container index, or they have a tendency to hedge their revenues for the forthcoming years. And instead of doing 6 months or 1 year contract with big clients, or they might do 2 years or 3 years contract, because for the shipping line is good, and actually for the client it is good. They are both hedging their risks, and you can diversify your suppliers. That goes with nearshoring, obviously, and of course, and 3D printing increasing. That is a mature industry which is more than 30 years old. It's a bit expensive, but when cost of freight is so expensive, it becomes very attractive at the end of the day. Nearshoring is a consequence. Normally, the cost of transportation compared with the cost of a product is less than 10% of the cost of the product. Nowadays, with the rates which have increased by 10 to 15 times, you have industries which have highlighted in yellow, where the cost of the transportation is between 10 and 100% of the cost of the products. These are the industries where there is no onshoring or de-offshoring happening right now. Food has increased by 30% all over the world since the beginning of 2020. Bad news. When will it stop? That's a $1 million question. I'm not answering that question, of course. I'm just giving possible answers out of 1 million possible answers. Obviously, when COVID-19 will stop, because then immediately there is no more lockdowns and you have more supply. Then imagine there is a new strain of COVID-19, and instead of having 5 million dead, we have suddenly 500 or 600 million dead. That will be a dramatic population reduction, and hopefully people will stop buying e-commerce, stuff on e-commerce website and keep the subsidy from the government to buy food. You see, when government subsidies or stimulus will stop for developed world, when maybe in 2023, when all this capacity, 10, 15 to 20% of new container ships comes, when ports or airports stop their lockdowns, when tourism will restart because people will spend more into that rather than in physical things, when nearshoring will reduce trade sufficiently for actually balancing supply and demand, and geopolitical changes can have an impact. For instance, if the US would decide to restart the trade wars, or to increase, because they have not stopped, to increase their trade wars dramatically, that would reduce trade, which would facilitate the flows. Or imagine that suddenly we decide that globalization is a good idea, I recommend, then we would optimize everything we have and there would be more supply. China says when there is, in the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. And I like that. I like that because it's true. So what are the opportunities? There is an increase of transportation costs. It is actually potentially good for freight forwarders because they can make more margin. Go for e-commerce. Everybody's shipping or selling by e-commerce at the moment. It is a good idea to go by e-commerce. Anything to digital, go for it. Trade applications, holographic contact, go for it. Invest in ships, warehouses, 3D printing, 4D printing. Now is the time. And there is an insufficient cash flow in the whole supply chain all over the world. So therefore, go for it. If you are a shipping line, you may want to consider being more flexible in terms of payment terms, and maybe try to start offering basically financing directly or indirectly. And for finance or lending companies, it's a marvelous opportunity. There is in sustainability, on the sustainability side, a marvelous opportunity. You can see on the graph on the right, the world emissions by sectors in 2019. And you see transportation is 15.5% in orange. On the left, you can see for transportation itself, sea freight or sea transportation is 2%. So this 2% is being addressed by the IMO, International Maritime Organization, by the EEXI 2023. So in 2023, all the shipping lines in the world, all the ship owners have to follow the new rules. And they have two ways to follow these rules. Either you reduce the speed of the ships, not a good idea, that would reduce the capacity as a result, or you change the technology, you put scrubbers, or for new build ships, they are now built on LNG or on methanol rather than the worst bunker fuel, and therefore you have the thing. So I think it's good time for pushing the IMO to push the ship owner and shipping lines to go for technology solution rather than speed, because now they have the cash, you see. Because they are making money, so good, now they can. They lost money for 20 years, the shipping lines, you have to understand that. There were many shipping lines bankrupt in the last 20 years. Now they're making money, first time in 20 years. There is a very good opportunity, what I call the bottleneck watch. You create a website on the internet, which is basically monitoring the lockdowns of countries, ports, and airports with the daily productivity of each port and airport, with the status of trucking, railways, and containers upstream and downstream. And then that could be good. Maybe it could be done by the WTO, IATA, if they have the cash, I don't know, IMO, or Hong Kong government, or maybe China government in the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. And that would, that would help to position Delhi and to brand that brand as a gateway purpose. Everybody would be used to go to see that every day. Same as the Johns Hopkins Hospital. Nobody has been there, but everybody knows it now because we look at some figures every day. If you need help for that, RCMO, my organization, we can help. Finance. There is an increase or decrease of 20% of value of the US M2 for the last few months. And in parallel, there is a global debt increase, at least in developed world. We are coming to a global inflation. In other words, we have less revenue and everything will be more expensive. So we're going to suffer. Risk mitigation. So we have to watch these things. Geopolitics can have an impact. Iran and Venezuela can have an impact. They represent 1/6 of all of oil production and transportation worldwide. And therefore, there is a shadow fleet of hundreds of ships that could be added to the global fleet at any time, which at the moment is not counted in what I showed you. Then there is a barrel price. It's important to know that 1/3 of the refined production of oil is used for planes. Last year, remember, we went in negative rates for oil because at the same time we had lockdowns, no more cars used and so on. And at the same time, no more planes used. So it was, in the future, we went in negative in the Pulse Hub in the US. So now remember that the barrel price is controlled by the US through the OPEC. The US pulls the strings behind. Lockdowns have to be watched. That's what the opportunity I mentioned earlier. And then there are other disruptions such as climate change, which are getting more and more acute events in cold or in hot. It's irrelevant, but it's happening all over the world and more often. COVID-19, I will not develop on that, and I will not develop on the travel bubbles either. You can look at that later. There is so what is the future bringing us? Suspect, of course, COVID-19 to continue. We'll have probably waves of vaccinations every quarter all over the world. Climate change is increasing. There is nothing we can do about it except slow it down, really. Consumer goods are becoming more expensive, so is food, and therefore population unrest is going to increase as a consequence. So social systems are going to become more autocratic, a bit more like China, all over the world, and military conflicts are likely because people have a tendency, when there is unrest in their own population, to create a war here and there to export that problem and to keep control of their population. So prepare for the worst and hope for the best is always a good solution. Now, the essence of survival is adaptability, said Charles Darwin, and I like that. You see, on the left in pink, you have the COVID-19. The recession that follows is in blue, light blue. Climate change is a big green wave, and biodiversity collapse is a blue wave. But the sixth mass extinction, on which has started 150 years ago, on which we are in the middle of it more or less, is coming. So we need to prepare for all these things. We are intelligent human beings. We can prepare for that. So you see, the model of how humanity acted or reacted upon COVID-19 is basically the model or the measurement or the measure on which, or the benchmark on which we can address the sixth mass extinction. I mean, I'll let you assess whether we have good odds or bad odds. I do not want to comment on that. My conclusion: supply and demand rules the world. So whether you are for globalization or for nationalism does not matter. If you want to deglobalize, you'll pay everything more expensive. If you want to globalize, you pay everything cheaper. But whatever we choose, we will have basically to assume the consequences. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. In less than about 45 minutes, you give us a quick talk. There's a lot of knowledge in the shipping and also the transportation and logistic industry. Yeah, how come you know such a lot of knowledge?
I'm an expert in supply chain. Supply chain, we are masters of chaos. That's what I said earlier.
Okay.
And I mean, consciously or not, but we have to look at everything. We have to look at sustainability as well and understand where it is our place in the global sustainability, which is much more than shipping, of course, but still we are 15.5%.
Okay, any of you, if you have any question, please type in to the question box. But before you are thinking of question, in fact, on my side, I also have some question, and maybe Stephen also have some question. Yeah. For you, hope it's not so challenging. But I believe you can answer all those kind of challenging questions.
Give me hard questions, please.
Yeah. You mentioned that the so-called the freight market, they do have a lot of trouble, bottleneck, a lot of problem, but the one of the shipping company is still quite profitable. Yeah, and they are making good profit. And for many years, they don't have a very good figure, good returns, but now they have. Do you think that they are doing something bad or some collusion such that they maintain the high price of the freight rate?
No, I don't believe so. The FMC in the US and the equivalent in China and Europe actually watching that very carefully, that there be no collusion between shipping lines, and there is no collusion between shipping lines. What there is in the global supply chain world, which is shipping lines, airlines, trucking companies, railways companies, ports, airports, there is a fabulous work. We have millions of people and millions of companies working very hard with their co-expertise to solution all these challenges, you see? And they are being very successful, considering 100 to 120 heart attacks constantly in the humanities supply chain. The work is fabulous. The shipping lines are not doing anything wrong. They're doing everything they can to help solve it. Let's look at Long Beach case in the US, which is the biggest port in the US, which is now with 55 ships waiting in front of it, while it's not even in lockdown. Why is that? Because all the shipping lines have chartered all the container ships and all the bulk ships they could on all the market, and they have put those ships on the Asia, Europe and Asia, US trades, which are demanding more capacity. And so they have more capacity now. But the ports of Long Beach, which is a bottleneck, just by its limited capacity, cannot handle more than what they can handle. And therefore, that's where the bottleneck is. It's not the shipping lines, now it's the port. And it's the port plus the truck drivers or the trucks and the railways behind. Now, the FMC in the US, if they wanted really to do something instead of trying to do political things and greenwashing as usual, Europe is good at greenwashing too. But what they could, they can use the US military, send hundreds of thousands of trucks at Port of Long Beach, unload the containers, put them in these trucks, deliver them to whatever warehouse or supermarket or hypermarket it has to be delivered, give back the empty containers to the shipping line that will be reloaded right away to be available for the next shipments, or to exporters of the US. There will be a share for each, of course. But that's where the US US government can help, not by doing political decisions that will have no other impact than slow down the whole process.
A follow-up question. Is it a good decision to invest in those kind of shipping company nowadays?
They are making, in 2021, they're estimated or expected to make 80 to 100 billion US dollar profit. I mean, I'll let you be the judge. Now, you see, in airlines, they have lost 126 billion US dollars last year. Yeah. And you have 50 or 30, I don't remember how many, but you have that in my presentation, airlines which are bankrupted. So yeah, you can invest in warehouses because everybody is increasing their inventory. So invest in warehouses, probably invest in trucks, probably invest in shippings or in ships at the moment. Yes, indeed. But remember, it's a cycle. So sooner or later, they're going to go down to where it was and they're going to lose money again or be just at break even. Same as what they have been for 20 years.
It's tough.
It's cycles of industry. I'll let you be the judge. You are specialized investors more than me.
Yes. Then Stephen, any question on your side?
Just heard about that. There's a bottleneck tipping point of 2 weeks. Why is 2 weeks?
2 weeks is fascinating. It's like in many things in the world or in humanity, it's something which is logical and illogical at the same time. Look, the Suez Canal is blocked for 2 weeks and everybody's working very hard at unblocking it. And we knew that when you had 400 ships, 200 ships waiting on each side of the Suez Canal, there was a choice. Do we use the other option, which is to go around Africa or not? Because that takes 2 more weeks to do that. Or do we wait for the Suez Canal to be unblocked? And some people or some shipping line, they left half of the ships there and the other half went around Africa, you have to know. Okay. Of course. But then that was, with every day you have to reweight your odds. And then every day that it becomes longer, there is a probability that it becomes longer, too long. And therefore you don't have a choice. So for instance, if you have ships with animals on it and you have animal feed to feed them every day, you have a limit of food. So you cannot wait too long. Then you might take the option of 2 weeks run more, because if it lasts 3 or 4 weeks, all the animals on the ships die. So you see, you have many, many consequences. So these 2 weeks is both logical and illogical. I suppose specialized investors in investment funds would have very specialized equations to explain that to us. But we can see it in supply chain. 2 weeks is a tipping point, beyond which, or under 2 weeks, people are patient. And over 2 weeks, people find solutions, which sometimes will have structural difference, create structural difference.
But at the beginning of the incidents, it is quite hard for the shippers to estimate whether it will take longer than 2 weeks or less than 2 weeks.
It is basically impossible. Yeah. And that is one of the big challenges. Supply chain is all about planning, management. We cannot plan at the moment. And that's for the whole supply chain, suppliers, customers, all the transformation intermediaries, the agents in transportation, whether they are shipping lines, trucking companies, railways. It's a nightmare. We are doing an impossible work or an impossible job in the supply chain industry, whatever the interlocutor. What we are doing is phenomenal because we cannot plan. So we are acting and reacting and solving problem shooting where we were doing 20 times a day. We are now doing it 2,000 times a day. as much as that.
Okay.
But supply chain planning is now more or less impossible, you're correct.
Yeah, there's a question about page 20. Could you, page 20? It's about the flight rate, the container flight rate again, yeah. Page number 20?
20, can you put us on page 20?
20. Okay.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, the question is now free career, CMA, Harper, Go, and Muscat, they said that they will hold the freight rate now. What do you think about this?
So they said they will stop increase the spot rates. That's what they said. It doesn't mean they stop increasing the surcharges on one hand, and it doesn't. And they said they will stop the spot rates, and it also doesn't mean they will not continue to negotiate with existing big customers for whatever rates. But when you negotiate with a big customer, you'd rather now negotiate as a shipping line point of view for a 2-3 years contract. You know, they don't load at these guys. They don't load at 20,000 US. That's a spot rate. They still load at 4, 6, 8,000 US dollars. So, but you know, this is much more conservative, of course, but now you edge it to 2 or 3 years. So it's good for the shipping line. And for the client, if you're Walmart or Carrefour or whoever, and you have no idea where the world is going, because looking at it, it's not very reassuring, that might be a safe bet, because you can still live with that while you cannot live with the 20,000 US, you see? So that's what they are doing at the moment. So they are putting priority to long-term contracts, and that can be for big customers, and for small customers, it is done through the freight forwarders. You see, freight forwarders also benefit from contracts with shipping lines, of course. And therefore, these freight forwarders will address all the small customers. That's how it works. Shipping lines don't have the time to address a small customer of 1 to 10 TEUs a year. Freight forwarders do have that time. Freight forwarders can be back-to-back contracts with shipping lines. Does it answer your question?
There's another question from my friend Stephen Chenna. If the food or consumer product price increase because of the higher transportation costs and inflation, then people should consume less. If this is the case, it should balance the supply and demand in certain extent. Do you agree?
I agree with you. I agree with you. First, I'm not sure we have in 2021, I don't have the numbers yet, so I don't know, but I'm not sure we have so much of an increase in 2021 in trade. We have for certain months compared with last year, but last year was dramatic, and last year was already minus 1% on global trade by containers. There is another thing, which is all these subsidies that the government, rich governments in rich countries are giving to their population. So it is for the population to be able to pay their rent and to eat food, you see. But many people are still using it for spending on e-commerce websites and so on, because that's what humanity does. And as a consequence, we still have a lot of orders. But I agree with you otherwise on the structural logic of the thought, yes.
But how? But in a global situation, there's a lot of people are in a hunger situation.
There is, yes.
Yeah, that's not good. On the other hand,
the only way, if you want to have nobody hungry anymore, is you globalize. You globalize the world, and then the world is completely optimized, and you take care of everybody with a minimum sure for everybody. Then there is no more hunger. If you don't globalize, there will be always competition between countries, between different powers, and they don't really care about people dying or people starving. They just care about power. Okay. That's how the world functions. That's how humanity functions.
Yeah, but
in reality, it seems the trend is at the opposite side, because we are breaking up the globalization trend.
The trend is not the other way. Oh, yes, you mean the global trend? Yeah. Yes, but what can I do? What can I say? I can just say what I'm saying to you, but you know, I have zero power there. The only power I have is to pass the message. Be careful. The more we break down globalization, the more everything will become more expensive. Yeah. The logic in trade is very simple. When you manufacture 2, is always cheaper than 1. So if you manufacture 100 million of pieces of something, it's cheaper than manufacturing 20 million. So now if that 100 capacity of production, which was usually in China or India, is now relocalized in 5 different production capacity in the world of 20 million each, Fair enough, but that will be more expensive. But it might not be bad to have 5 different manufacturing production at the end of the day, because it has to rebalance things as well. So remember, not everything is black or white. It's sometimes a bit gray. And having 5 production capacity in the world is probably wiser, especially for masks or PPE. So for urgent things, it is wiser. For food, it would be marvelous if we would do that. The challenge is at the moment, out of 200 countries in the world, 15 countries are exporting the food to 200 countries. That means you have more or less most of the countries in the world which are not self-sufficient in food. That's strictly irresponsible, of course.
Another question is, are there any action that the government can take to ease the difficulty, or just leave it to the service provider to solve the problem? What's your view?
So the consortium, like, or the federal consortium like the US, the FMC, there is the equivalent in US, the equivalent in China, actually watching the shipping lines very carefully. They're scrutinizing every move they make at the moment, you see. And they are scrutinizing that there is no collusion, and therefore there is no collusion. Okay, that's good. They're fulfilling their role. But otherwise, no, by rules and regulation, they can't really help to solve that challenge. All the private actors, shipping lines, airlines, trucking companies, freight forwarding companies, railways companies, are doing the best they can, really. What they can do, yes, they can ask the federal government or the military of each country to send trucks at all these ports which are in complete congestion. And the military trucks, which still have to charge a minimum because otherwise you unbalance the whole market, they will facilitate, because otherwise you have mountains of containers at ports, and then it blocks everything. It adds to the congestion, you see? So yes, the military can help at the moment to fulfill part of the delivery, because there is a shortage of truck drivers, a shortage of trucks, and the military trucks, and they are in caserns doing nothing, sleeping, and the military, they are just training every day. So good, instead of sending them to Afghanistan or to whatever, sending them help the civilian population. What a good idea. I mean, I would be very proud of a president doing that, for instance.
Okay. Okay, there's a, okay. The view from Mr. Stephen Chen is, my optimistic view is that here are a lot of hidden demand of commodity. Currently, because of the lockdown, okay, if it will be helpful to the global supply chain business after the pandemic, freight rate will still be high after then. What do you think about this?
Sorry, what is the question?
Okay,
I did not
you can see it. Yeah.
This one?
Yeah, this one. Yeah. This is the view from Stephen Chen.
Sorry. So I'm not sure I understand your question fully. Already Felix read it word by word, and I didn't understand, but I will try to say what I understand. What you're saying is that there might be a lot of delays on commodities side, that's upstream of the global supply chain. Yes, that is possible, but not for the energy. Energy is pipelines based on in the terminal, so that's more or less plug and play, that's smooth. But there is probably for other commodities possible. Will freight rates be high after COVID-19? I suppose that's what you're asking. Okay, imagine COVID-19 will stop now. How long do we need to resolve the situation? The global supply chain will have resolved it within 6 months. Now, globally, the global transportation industry will have solved it within 6 months. Let me rephrase. The global supply chain is much more complex because it involves all the suppliers, customers, and so on. So if you are a customer and you have done a hybrid of nearshoring, offshoring, de-offshoring, and so on. So you still have your suppliers in China and India to which you order now 10 or 20% of what you were ordering before. And now you order from other suppliers in Eastern Europe, Northern Africa, and Mexico. Then when COVID-19 stops, if your suppliers in India and China have not bankrupted, you will still, and if they are still cheaper than the other ones, of course you will go back to them. And if they have bankrupted, no, you cannot go back to them. You see what I mean? So that will be the consequence. So the consequences on the global supply chain will last for years. Actually, that is the structural changes that I mentioned after 2 weeks, the tipping points.
In the PowerPoint, you mentioned that the current freight rate is talking about 10 times or higher.
Yes.
Then after COVID, would it be back to normal, or it will keep still high?
It is really the result of that. Supply and demand. That's my conclusion. Supply and demand rules the world. We are not to decide. It's the people that want to order more of this, of that, and the people who can supply it. At the moment, there is a shortage of semiconductors in the world.
Yeah, right.
Why? Because the world is using more semiconductors everywhere in everything we build. That's the first reason. Second reason, because of the lockdowns, everybody now wants a computer because we work online through computers, and your children are also in school online. And therefore, there is a huge demand of computers, mobile phones, a gaming console and everything, which ask or require semiconductors. And you see, and so more demand, and the supply was not probably less. Actually, there was a bit less for the car industry middle of last year, but that restarted 3 months later. You see, but that was all then. Then all the semiconductors manufacturers were providing for all these other industries that were more profitable. And when the car manufacturers came back, they said, "Yeah, sure, but you're second now. You're not first." So there is all this consequence of feedback loops that are impossible to forecast before. Why do you think China, when you change an ecosystem and then change laws, they create always a lab test? That's what Shanghai Free Trade Zone is. Shanghai Free Trade Zone is a kind of China where you change the system in many, many different laws. The first clients of Shanghai Free Trade Zone were Citibank and Standard Chartered. They were not warehouses and factories. And that was expanded in different special economic zones all over China to test what would be the thing. And then when it is balanced, it's not balanced there, you change the law a little more. When it's balanced, then you deploy it in different situations. And then you deploy it for all over China. But China does that very wisely, very cautiously, and they test for years before changing the system. You see? So that's why China, in this case, in terms of management of the society, is much more advanced than any other societies in the world, because they are very cautious.
Thank you. In fact, I do have some questions, but maybe we, because we are running almost out of time. It's time for us to say thank you to you. Yeah, and thank you, Nicholas. And
yeah.
He spent a lot of time and effort to prepare the presentation to us. And I think all of us will agree that the presentation is very fruitful, very informative. And I think everyone agreed that you are really an expert. And in case in future you have any update on the new situation.
Sure, happy to.
Okay, I think we probably will invite you to speak about it. Yeah, because it is quite difficult to forecast the future nowadays. It's very complicated.
It's more and more difficult because of what I show there in this slide. I show you future here. I mean, when you have more climate change increase, or it's not more, it's climate change increase, that means you have more extreme events, cold or hot, everywhere in the world. Difficult to forecast. What is happening with the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic Ocean? Nobody knows. It's always been changing anyway, but it's changing with the patterns that is unusual now. And we are very worried that, you know, who is feeding the world? US, Russia, many countries in Europe. If these countries become as cold as Siberia in Europe, and if US become as hot as Iran, because without the Gulf Stream, that's what happens, then who's going to feed the world? Because they're going to have their production or productivity of food decrease by 1/3, 2/3, nobody knows. But then, of course, I mean, you are in Qatar. Qatar is feeding 10% of its population from what it's producing. Same in Dubai. So what do you do with the population? They die, or you send them back where they came from, probably. You see? So because these are special places. But you have 180 countries in the world importing food all over the world constantly.
But I think there will be equilibrium, but it might have a lot of impact to the society.
There is always equilibrium. Yeah. If you plan ahead and you see that this is coming.
Anyway, thank you very much for all for the next presentation. I believe Stephen and I will stay here to discuss with Nicholas. Yeah. But anyway, because of the time is out, and thank you for your listening.
Let's give Nicholas our big hands.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay,
thank you very much for your time.
Yes, goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yes, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.